Welcome, everyone, to the Therapy in the Great Outdoors podcast. Today, we're going to do much longer than a 10-minute takeaway on a recent research article because I have Hannah Burke here with me. She is a Ph.D. candidate at Colorado State University.
You got it.
And a candidate means that she has passed her qualifying exams, preliminary exams. They call them different things at different universities. Maybe you can talk with us a little bit about that, Hannah. And she is in the process of doing her dissertation and dissertation research now. So, Hannah, welcome. Thank you for being here. I'm really excited to talk about this article that you just published.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to share about it.
So tell us a little bit about how you came to this point in your journey. And then we're going to talk about the article, which I should tell people, I meant to say this in the little intro I just did, but it's an article about nature-based pediatric OT, but there are some implications for PT and speech therapists, other allied health professionals that you guys mentioned in there. So we'll talk about that as part of this too. I didn't want anyone to be scared away that this is an OT article if they are not in the field of OT. So that being said, we'll talk about the article in a bit. Tell us a little bit about you, how you came to be doing your PhD, and then we'll dive into the research that you published.
Yeah, so I have been working as a pediatric occupational therapist for about 8 years and always said I was not going to go back to school. I feel like that's not unusual for people that end up getting their PhD, but I really love nature-based work and I really loved camps specifically. That's how I got involved in doing practice outdoors, was through summer camps, Camp Avanti in the US and then Camp Jabiru in Australia. And we had started doing program evaluation at Camp Jabiru and wanted to advance that into doing research. And Tracy Stackhouse kind of started that program eval process. And then Dr. Shelley J. Lane got involved at University of Newcastle, and she's incredible and had an opportunity to be involved in a PhD program when she moved to Colorado State University. And I couldn't pass it up because we were looking at exploring that camp model more. And it seemed like a great time to get involved in doing research on nature-based pediatric practices. So that's the short story.
Yay. Well, I know we what do you call it? Like we bantered for a little bit before we hit record about the struggles and challenges of being in a PhD program. And we realized that would probably not be interesting for the majority of people listening.
Yes, so I can just share the joys.
Right. We'll share the outcomes, the beauty of publishing research that actually gets out there in the world. And we will spare you the details of the behind the scenes tears and struggles that are there. But just know that, I mean, I do think it's worth mentioning because it really, I think until I have not really gone through it yet, starting to, but like until you go through it, you don't appreciate like how hard it is to get research published. And I, again, said this before we started recording, but I am so impressed with this article and the work you did on it. It is just so clear that there was so much thoughtfulness put into the process, and just the quality of the article is, it's just top notch. So talk about what the article is. It's a scoping review. Talk to us about why this was needed and what a scoping review is for anyone who maybe hasn't read one before or isn't familiar with that term.
Yeah. So the reason I was excited to do this is largely because, as anyone listening probably knows, nature-based practices in allied health are typically considered emerging practice areas. Certainly, they've been around for a long time in various ways, but specifically pediatric practices are kind of coming into more popularity, getting out there. People are getting more into it. And in order to build a literature base around that and to add credibility for certain types of people, including occasionally funders, it's important for there to be an evidence base. And that evidence base starts often with literature reviews. And so we started with a scoping review, which is different from a systematic review because it doesn't include only specific study designs and specific types of research or evidence. It also can include gray literature, and it tends to have a broader focus on just identifying what's out there instead of critiquing the quality of evidence that exists. So those are like the broad differences and why we chose a scoping review, because this is really kind of a new area. And as we found, there's not tons of literature yet. And so this is kind of that call to action to add to this literature base to support all the work that is already being done. That was the starting place.
Yeah, a good starting place. Exactly. And that's what scoping reviews are for, right? It's like, what's out there? What is out there right now? What do we see starting to be published in a certain area? Give people a reminder what gray literature is. I know sometimes when you're in an academic program, you remember these terms. And if you've not been in school for a while, it might be like, what is that?
Thank you. Yes, to clarify. So gray literature is content that isn't necessarily published in a peer-reviewed journal. So that can be things like practice magazines. It could include things like blog posts, although we didn't include those in our content. So it's just things that are not peer-reviewed. And that's important in occupational therapy because we do publish so much in these less academic spaces in order to communicate with our peers and advance practice that way. So we were excited to be able to include things that were not just this tightly controlled peer-reviewed research that really is less existent in this space right now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. So is the definition, because I mean, I'm showing my own forgetting of things here, but is a definition of gray literature that it's not peer reviewed? Because I published in the special interest section, the AOTA special interest section. And while it wasn't, I was solicited to write it, they asked me to write it, but it still went through some kind of peer review process. So it's weird because I often say I haven't published in a peer reviewed journal, because to me, that's the special interest section. For people who don't know, it's it's almost like a pamphlet of different articles that AOTA kind of produces every quarter or so. So it's like a quarterly kind of publication of articles related to special interest in the profession. So it's not like AJOT, the American Journal of Occupational Therapy. And there's a much more rigorous peer review process for those journals, right? So I often say, I haven't published in a peer reviewed journal, but it was peer reviewed what I published. Does that make sense? Or how do you think of that?
So I've never gone through the editing process for a special interest section. My understanding of the difference would be that I would call the special interest section review editing or just review versus double-blinded peer review for a journal article. I'm not saying that one of those is necessarily better than the others in a lot of contexts. Just because something is peer reviewed definitely does not mean it is good. And just because something isn't in a peer-reviewed journal doesn't mean that it isn't of really great quality. But that would be my understanding. We might need to add footnotes to this.
No, but that's, for me, even that's a great kind of way to think about it, because when I look back on it, you're right. They knew my name. It wasn't a blinded peer review process. And this manuscript that I'm about to submit for my dissertation work, or a portion of my dissertation work, is a blinded process. You have to submit without the authors' names on the front, and so that they don't know who the authors are and they can blindly review it. So thank you for clarifying that, because I was like, wait, gray literature, hold on. Is my brain confused?
Nope, you got it. You got it.
Okay. So the title of the article that you all published. So, you want to talk about who you published with?
I would be happy to. I'm very excited about this author team because it shows the mentoring and support that I've gotten very close to home. I'm the first author on this because it was my idea and I spearheaded this project. But my co-authors are Lynette Burke, who is my mother, and Colleen Hacker, who is her partner and business partner and has been my mentor since I was an OT student. I did all my observation hours with her at her clinic. And then, of course, my advisor and mentor and friend, Dr. Shelley J. Lane, who is who I'm working with on my dissertation. And they've been really supportive of me wanting to dive into this literature and were great to work with on this project. So that's who wrote this article with me.
And Shelley, just for reference, Shelley is the co-author of the Sensory Integration Theory and Practice textbook. For people who don't know of her or know her name, it probably sounds familiar. She's prolific in her publications, primarily on neuroscience and sensory integration. But I wish I could have worked with her. I worked with her briefly to write a proposal to possibly do my PhD at the university where she was in Australia. And then I got accepted and they stopped all international student scholarships. So it would have been $100,000 for me to go to school there. And I was like, I love you, Shelley, but I'm sorry, I don't have $100,000.
Whoops.
So
no.
I love that you're working with her, because she truly, I mean, I'm sure your mom and her partner are wonderful mentors as well, but like, I love Shelley. I love her work, and I am totally jealous that you get to work with her because she's wonderful. So great team. And the title of the article is called Nature-Based Pediatric Occupational Therapy, a Scoping Review. Very straightforward. So here you have the aim of the article. I'm going to read it directly from the abstract. Our purpose was to explore the scope of nature-based interventions used in pediatric occupational therapy and identify gaps in the existing literature. So why don't you tell us about how you guys went about doing this? Because it is so well written out and so rigorous the way you went about conducting this scoping review. And I want you to share kind of what you did with everyone because it's impressive.
Well, thank you. It was definitely a process of figuring out how we wanted this to go. I think it's not uncommon in a scoping review to end up refining your search process for this literature, just because it is more exploratory and less of a defined question necessarily. So we knew that we wanted to look at what was out there on nature-based occupational therapy, and we picked search terms, which are just the words we use that we felt would pull out these articles that would answer that question. And, we started with nature environment, nature-based, outdoor, natural environment, and we searched 6 databases. So those are just places that index different peer-reviewed journals and often gray literature also, like unpublished dissertations and theses fall in that category as well.
Okay.
So we searched using those terms in all of those databases and got over 1,000 articles back from that, some of which were duplicates, then we had to sift through and see like what is coming back specifically with occupational therapy, what is coming back about natural environment that is just an environment where occupations happen.
Yes.
So frustrating with that terminology to have to distinguish like a natural environment for a preschooler is not only outdoors. There are lots of natural environments.
Totally.
So that was a journey, but once we winnowed those down and had ones that we thought might fit our criteria, that is when we read each of the articles, and at least two authors had to read the article and decide if it belonged or not in terms of how it would answer our question. Through that process, we also decided to exclude animal-assisted interventions and interventions that were relying on human-made structures, which was an interesting thing.
Yeah.
So much of this conversation for our author team was around what do we want to consider a nature-based OT practice in this area where it's not defined yet. And so many articles, I shouldn't say so many. In this context, so many articles about like pool-based, like doing therapy at an aquatic center. And that's definitely like water is a natural element. That's like the main thing. But it also was a really specific type of intervention that would then skew all of our findings towards pool-based intervention. Or, hippotherapy or canine-assisted therapy, those things that are a little bit better defined. We didn't want to take the focus away from this broader scope of nature-based practice. So
because those practice areas actually have a lot of research behind them already, or probably just as much, and also are very specific applications of a nature piece, to a treatment session. So it's like almost a different modality. So how did you guys define, I think I have it here in the article here, but how did you guys define, you defined it as nature as a primary context and treatment modality was how you included articles, right?
Yes, exactly. And not having animals or a specific piece of nature be the only natural element or primary natural element.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the articles had to be in English, a service provided by OTs or occupational therapy practitioners with a population with at least 50% of the participants ages 0 to 21 years. So this really was pediatrics, like maybe older adolescents as well. But that's one thing I found in my dissertation research was like, there's not a lot, like the kid literature is not out there as much as there is literature with adults with nature-based work in general. The research is burgeoning and becoming much more superfluous, to use 2 large words in one sentence. I'm like, what's the word I'm looking for here? Let me just choose the most obnoxious one. So, okay, so that was the inclusion criteria. And then you went through this process. Now, how many were actually included? And then let's get into like what you found.
Yeah, so we ended up reading 77 articles, and of those, only 12 ended up being included in this review, which I love that gets to be included as part of the documentation. Like, we did read a lot to get to the only 12 that are included, but we were excited about what we got to include and what we were able to say based on what's been written. So 12 sounds maybe small, but I was excited about it.
I think 12. I mean, I've seen scoping reviews before with less than that comes up in the final kind of analysis. So I think 12 is a pretty good. I'm actually impressed too, because I literally wrote on here, need to cite this in my manuscript because I had to do final edits on it before I submit. Because you guys found, I mean, I felt like when I was doing my dissertation, I had to do, there's just so much literature constantly coming out. And from the time that I defended the dissertation, like the final copy was into my committee, I defended it, I passed, and then I had to make like the final little edits. A bit of feedback from one of my committee members was, you might want to like check and see if there's any more literature out there. Oh my gosh, down a rabbit hole. I got so overwhelmed because there was just so much more than like a few months earlier when I had published like that Fife Johnson study in pediatrics. It's like a nature-based interventions, a systematic review on nature-based interventions for children, like in the journal Pediatrics. I mean, it's so amazing, exciting, right? It's so exciting.
That's what I feel so petty about. Like, every time a new one comes out, I'm simultaneously elated and dejected because it means more work on anything you've already been doing, but obviously primarily exciting.
Totally. So you guys found, what I was going to say is, like, you guys found articles I didn't even know existed. And I'm like, oh my gosh, did I not do a thorough enough search? Because it's like, it's crazy how some of these things can be kind of hard to find, especially the gray literature. They're harder to find. And so it just shows you guys did such an extensive process to really dig and find out what's out there about nature and pediatric OT. So where should we go from here? Like, what do you feel like are the things that people should know about this article? What did you find that kind of informs how we're going to move forward in our profession with this work?
Great question.
That's a broad question.
It's a broad question. And I think I just want to start by saying, I so appreciate how enthusiastic the community has been about this getting published. And I think once you read it, it's like, not duh, but like, we didn't say anything that people who are doing this don't already know. And I think that can feel a little bit like, okay, like, why are we doing research if we're already like operating assuming this? And my perspective, again, is we need to start this publication process so that people who don't live this work and aren't in it can appreciate it. And it's not great that they can't just appreciate it because of what we tell them, but that kind of exists in every space. And so, although I am so excited that this is published and it was such a joy to work on, and I do think there are fun findings, I don't think any of it is revolutionary. And I do think that, like, I can listen to your podcast, Laura, and be like, well, she just said one of the findings. Like, great. I'm glad it's consistent, but like, this isn't novel. It's just something that needs to be done, in my opinion. And so that's why this isn't like one of those intervention studies where you can be like, oh my gosh, this new thing that like we found and no one else knew before. It's more like a summary of all the things we know as practitioners in this space.
I want to give you some credit, because I'm grinning ear to ear over here. Sometimes on the podcast, I have to like remind myself to not say anything, because then it blocks out what you're saying, right? The way you would in normal conversation, like, oh my gosh, yes, I'm grinning ear to ear over here, because sometimes I'm like, did we really need research to tell us this when I read something? But this article, for me, as someone who's been doing this a little bit and like knowing kind of that there's just not a lot out there yet, I am so grateful, because it's almost like having a summary that validates the work that nature-based pediatric therapists are doing. And so don't sell yourself short. Give yourself some credit, you and your team, because really, I think we needed an article like this so badly to just be like, this is the article, then we can refer people to say, hey, and you guys even say in the end, in the conclusions, you're like, therapists who want to get started in this work might look at these articles in order to kind of help them see what else is out there. So like, I think it's a very, very much needed article. So let's talk about, you said one of the things in the article is like a definition of what is nature-based occupational therapy. So maybe we could just like kind of follow the flow of the article and let's talk about kind of each of the things in sequence. So what did you guys find about a definition? It's so clear and very defined, right?
It's so clear. No.
And that, I mean, comment on my part.
Truly, this is one of those things where like I am a very black and white thinker. So there are times when I need to remind myself, like, it doesn't need to be written out explicitly all the time. Like things don't need to be so concrete. And especially in OT spaces, we're so like fluid and working with people. And that is how it has to be. But the problem in research is that without clear definitions of things, it can be really difficult to make conclusions about what's causing change as support for the work that you're doing. And so we targeted finding a definition. And of course, the authors of the papers that are included here were not setting out to define what this practice area is.
Right.
And so this is like not about, oh man, why didn't these 12 authors write an explicit definition? That wasn't what their purpose was. But it was fun to read through and see what kind of came out as highlights for people who write about this practice area and try to think about a definition. Laura, I actually think your article had like the clearest explanation of what a nature-based OT practice is. And like you actually use nature-based therapy, which I think is a common phrase, but hasn't been and is more common in practice than it is in the literature. So
yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. And you know, I think taking practice outdoors seems to have started a lot for people with the increase of screen use and screen time and kids not being outside. But we know that it's about so much more than that, especially for the kinds of kids that come to OT, that it's about access to the outdoors and it's about the added benefits that they specifically can get. And so, you know, outlining that this is a special practice area for us, I think is important. And it's not just we're doing OT outside. It's really meaningful. And I think that there are kind of two ways to start a body of literature from my perspective. And one is a lit review and the other is what you're doing for your dissertation with grounded theory. And like, I do think that's part of why they're going to end up complementing each other so well, because we're starting with what people know about how this work impacts kids. And it's really just about concretizing it, I guess. I hate forcing something into a black and white label, but it's important in terms of outlining our scope of practice in this area. So
yeah. And one of the things, I think it was, outdoor therapies. The title of the article is Outdoor Therapies. I reviewed it on the podcast a while back. It's Harper's, one of the authors, but they say in that article, and other articles have said this too, that if we don't define what it is, then we can't generate a body of research around it. Because I know the episode that will have come out shortly before this I interviewed Carolyn Parker, who's a speech language therapist. And it was just such a great conversation. And we were talking about it. And she said, part of my work is just a lot of the time I'm taking those rote kind of speech therapy things we have to do. Like the reality is that some of our goals are like, this kid has to get 50 repetitions of this sound in the session. It's a very kind of data focused, you got to get it done in a session. So she's like, a lot of times I'm just taking those, I forget what she said, like flashcards or prompts or whatever they use in speech therapy, right? And she's taking those outdoors to do a traditional speech therapy activity and taking it outdoors. And so then we kind of got a little bit into like, what will we call that? Nature integrated, it's not nature based, because that would be like in a wild setting, you know, like we kind of were like just talking about like different terminology for different ways of doing nature based work.
Yeah.
That just disagrees with what I just said, using the word nature-based to define something else. But like, that's the challenge we have right now in communicating about it, is that there's not really a definition. It's not like some people would call something nature-based, even if it's inside and you're just integrating nature elements into a session. So in your study, though, when you looked at the scoping reviews, all of these services took place outdoors, right?
Yes.
That was one of the requirements.
That was a huge conversation as well. A lot of this for me was just like my own reflective practice on what do I consider a nature-based therapy, and taking plants and doing gardening at a table inside is a nature-based intervention, but it isn't really what I meant when I was talking about this. Exactly. And so like having to be more explicit and refine that was a big learning process for me. And, you know, that's why the language matters, because when we search for this literature, if you're trying to find something to support your work, you don't want to have to wade through people looking at plants inside. Like that's important for what it is, but if that's not what you're looking for, you need something else to be able to search that in a meaningful way. So
I defined it the same in my dissertation research. I defined it the same way as like it takes place outdoors and brings children into contact with elements of nature, such as like land. I did include animals, but I wasn't like, the point of my research was to like interview people. So I didn't want to be like, if you're a hippotherapist, I'm not interviewing you. Right. And that's actually what the committee actually told me I needed because of my study. I don't want to get us down a rabbit hole about my study. I'm sorry. But basically, they were saying, I'll talk about it at some point on the podcast, but like, basically the committee was saying to me, if your study is looking at nature-based therapy and you're coming up with a model to describe what pediatric occupational therapists consider to be nature-based practice, then you don't get to define it for them. You let them define what it is. And then you kind of have to have some parameters. So my parameter was, it has to take place outdoors. That was like a kind of line in the sand that I made for inclusion in my study. But it's just an example of how you have to decide what you're studying in order to focus your work. So there were kind of different types of definitions, right, that kind of came out. Do you want to talk about any of those, or like, where should we go from here? What do you think?
So I think, to me, a takeaway in terms of these different definitions is that what I had in my head, I mean, this just jumps so perfectly off of what you said about your work. I had an idea in my head of what I wanted the definition to be, and it isn't there. And part of that is because a lot of the articles that are included, like one is about adaptive hiking specifically. And that is a really specific thing to do as a nature-based intervention. But one of them is about farm-based intervention and doing occupational therapy in a farm context. And both of those things have space under this umbrella and could have like a specific way to describe them the same way hippotherapy does. Right. But in terms of adding to this umbrella term, it was not quite as helpful. So as we were alluding to, there is not a clear definition. It just doesn't exist. We couldn't synthesize one from what we have. But I do think the roots of it are there. And I think people in practice are building what that definition is. And so I'm hoping that like practice-based evidence can come add to this work, and it'll only grow. But it is kind of that call to action that we should be really explicit about what we're doing. And you should have a clear idea of what you mean, people in the world, when you're doing, if you're saying I'm doing nature-based whatever therapy, what does that mean to you? And being clear about that and knowing it so that you can articulate it and advance our standing in the world. That's a silly goal, but it's also important because that's how we help the kids. So
one of the things that was really hard for me was in grounded theory. Like, I'm just like, we are so alike for being PhD students. Like, we're like in that we aren't the typical kind of like, I don't know how to describe it. Like, both of us have often shared with one another, like, I'm very black and white thinker. Like, that's how I am. And the same, like what you just said too, which I don't think is always the case for PhD students, but anyway. But I do think grounded theory was really hard for me because you're supposed to not have a perspective, right? You're supposed to really try to remove your own perspective in order to like really look at what the participants are saying. And that was really hard for me to do. I had to constantly be checking my biases and doing all this journaling and like really try to set aside my own preconceived ideas about things in order to have more of a gray kind of like gray area for what is and is not nature-based therapy based on what participants said. So I'd love to know, like, just as an aside, how would you define nature-based therapy?
What a big question.
You
I
won't be
don't
held
know.
forever to this answer. Like views can change. So, I'd be interested based on you're looking at the literature so much. Like, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've kind of spoken about some of the elements that to me feel essential. And I think a lot of my thinking on this does come from the book that you were just sharing and saying, like, this is
Oh
a
yeah.
Bible of OT about nature-based therapies.
Yeah. And it's nature-based. I mentioned it on the last podcast too.
Yep.
It's nature-based therapy by Harper, Rose, and Segal. It's like not written by OTs at all, but
No,
but
but
it
it was so
re-
helpful to me in
relevant.
thinking through this. Yeah,
Yeah.
very relevant. And I think specifically because they changed the way I thought about how nature is participating in an intervention session. I think this is something a lot of people know. And from the hints that I've heard from you, sounds like something that came out of your research as
Yes.
well, that like nature is playing an active role and isn't just something that's being used or something that we're existing in. And I think
Yeah.
that isn't giving a clear definition, but I do think it's one of the pieces that I hope gets highlighted as this work moves forward is the way that doing nature-based occupational therapy and or any allied health profession in a nature-based context is, to me, more than in a lot
Yeah.
of ways just doing intervention by yourself inside as a therapist. And I think adding in the piece of working with nature to support outcomes for our clients feels important to me. And so I'm hoping that that is a piece of it. I don't know that that's a comprehensive definition, but I hope that that ends up coming out. And I think it feels like it will.
Yeah. That's just beautiful. I mean, I often am like, hey everyone, just hit the back button on your podcast and listen to that last 1 minute again when someone says something really great. That's like it is. I mean, I do feel like it's like nature-based therapy to me is not just going outdoors. It can
Right.
be, but it also is like a process of noticing nature and
Yeah.
how nature influences the therapy process with a child. So yeah, and gosh, you've really listened because that did come out in my research and I
Well,
don't even know that I've talked that much about it. So yeah,
just
yeah,
something
I'm
that's
I'm
very
excited
interesting.
to what'd you say?
It's just something I'm very interested in. So, you
Right.
tune in
Yeah, you
specifically.
remember it, right?
Yep.
Yep, yep.
Yep.
So okay, so we kind of have this there's lots of different things being called nature-based occupational therapy, lots of different programs, lots of different ways of defining it. You guys mentioned a little bit, you have a paragraph about theories. And I thought it was really cool that it does seem like a number of the articles talked about theories that were informing their work. And I think a lot of times theory gets like stuck on a shelf after we leave school and we just are kind of like we look at theory as not practical or not useful in daily practice with kids. So I don't know if you have comments on that or if you mentioned some of them maybe that you guys found. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I also was surprised at how many were mentioned. I
Mhm.
think it's really important, specifically in literature, to reference theory, but I love when therapists use theory to support their clinical reasoning and reflective practice in their
Yep.
work, because I think it just takes you to another level. And, it resonated with me that some of the theories that got called out were the ecology of human performance,
Hmm.
occupational adaptation, obviously person environment, occupation performance, the
Right.
PEOQ model for OT is going to come out. And then with the specific populations, I mean, there were some articles that included kiddos with like physical disabilities, which I think is a space that we'll need to grow in as a profession for
Hmm.
nature-based OT. But the focus was a lot more on kids with neurodevelopmental differences. And so sensory integration is getting brought up, child development theory in general. And then, of course, the nature theories about attention restoration and biophilia. And
Yeah.
then you mentioned forest school pedagogy. We bring all of this to the table. And I think the beauty of OT work is how we integrate theory
Yeah.
and how we
Yeah.
can use it to support us. And I don't know personally that I cared as much about theory until I started doing nature-based work. And because it is an emerging practice area, it feels so much more important to be explicit in your thinking around like, okay, I'm pulling this from Ayers SI, I'm pulling this from the idea of attention restoration theory, and I need to be paying attention to what nature is bringing to this session. It's not just me, it's like a co-treatment and like, how are we working with each other? And being explicit around that thinking, it contributes to not feeling burnout because you actually feel impactful in your work. I mean, it's so many layers beyond just, I pulled a theory out from my OT whatever course. Like, it can be meaningful. It can have power in your practice. And so I was happy that they were mentioned and that we were able to bring that out in this article and not just say people should have talked about theories.
Right. Theory wasn't mentioned a lot in the interviews I did, but also I didn't ask about it. Wasn't like I was like trying to ask about it. So I did have to write, like, it wasn't mentioned a lot, but it's not that because I didn't explicitly ask about it, that's part of grounded theory. You're not supposed to try to like dig for what you want to find, right? You're trying to let it kind of be this free flowing, very not black and white process that was very challenging for me in a growth edge. But I do there were kind of insinuations of theory, like sensory integration theory. A few people mentioned like family systems theory or polyvagal theory, or so I do think it's pretty evident that, like, I think a lot of times practitioners, and I guess I'm assuming for PT and speech, I think we want to use theory to inform practice, but it's like we don't exactly know how to do it. So I'm having ideas right now too of like, maybe this is something that like could be facilitated on like calls, like that I do in some of my programs, like helping people to use theory to address a specific practice problem and like do the thinking together as a group using the theory to help guide you. Because that's where, when we don't know what to do in practice, when we have a sticky situation or a problem that we're facing in practice, theory gives you a way to like guide your thinking to help come to potential solutions and then try out those solutions. I think we sometimes lack the time or energy to do that. And so creating and carving out space to do that, I think might be helpful to people. But I'm down a rabbit hole about theory, but
no, I mean, I love it. I think it's part of what has so advanced the work at Camp Jabiru, where people get to go and spend the whole week focusing on a really specific group of kids and every day talk about each one of those kids as a group using a systematic clinical reasoning process that integrates all the theories. I mean, it allows for such high level thinking that I don't think is as possible in everyday life, but it is, having the experience of doing it in a mentored call in whatever way helps you be able to do it more intuitively and more as an in the moment way of thinking that is integrated into your practice. So who knows, maybe part of the reason it's not brought up as much is because a lot of these therapists who are doing nature-based work now have been practicing for so long that it isn't top of mind anymore because it is embodied for them. And sometimes bringing it to the surface when you enter a new practice context is important, but it's also a lot of people with experience are branching out into this work to like revitalize their practice. And that is really inspiring. But as these new practitioners are entering the field, it's going to be important to go back to that base and support them with their reasoning. So love theory.
I do too. And I love that you brought up experienced people are coming to this practice area to avoid burnout. That came up in my research too. There's so many correlations here. This is corroborating. Our research is like agreeing. This is very good.
Yes, I love it.
The committee told me I had to kind of rewrite some sections because they told me I sounded biased when I was saying like people burned out in other. And I'm like, well, I only interviewed people who are doing nature-based work. So of course they love it. And I can't change that many people told me they were burning out in other practice areas, right? Like who wouldn't burn out working in schools where you have like 60 kids on your caseload? I mean, let's just be real. The other practice settings are not very conducive to mental health and avoiding burnout as a therapist. So that's a whole other podcast we could do. But let's talk about some of the outcomes you guys found from nature-based OT intervention. What were these articles saying?
Yeah, so, the two gray literature. So the two articles that were vetted through a double-blinded peer review process did have some outcome measures, not outcome measures that I personally have used. They were looking at the child and adolescent scale of participation, the social skills improvement system, children's self-concept scale, things that feel very relevant to the work we do. And they did find positive outcomes, positive changes over the courses of their interventions. And then all of the articles that were not reporting on intervention effectiveness were also, of course, talking about the positives of doing this kind of work. It's all the stuff we all feel so passionately about around increasing not just a discrete skill for these kiddos, but increasing, their ability to exist in the world and participate in the world in a way that is meaningful to them, getting down to, the risk-taking, fine motor skills, attention, all the stuff we know was brought up. And I think that's one of the areas that was the most comprehensive in terms of what was referenced about the benefits for this, which to me just reflects that people who are writing about these emerging practice areas are trying to show the benefits and get out on paper. Like, these are all the potential ways that this could be good in your practice, and like, go check it out. And so, hopefully we'll get some more effectiveness research soon. I know stuff is being done, but it was all very positive, of course.
Yeah. So again, I've shared this before, but I was like dinged in my data review meeting that I sounded biased, right? Like in my presentation of like, one of my research questions was like, how do nature-based pediatric OTs perceive the differences between indoor and outdoor practice? Well, of course, there were all these positive things. And then one of my committee members was like, well, that's because you didn't ask the question then, and I was like, point taken, you are correct. Like, I did not delve into like, tell me all the negative things. I did ask about negative things working outdoors with kids, but I didn't really like say what are the negatives in comparison to indoor, maybe. I don't know. But one of the things that came up when I went back and did kind of more data gathering from the participants was this idea, which you guys mentioned as well in the article, in the scoping review you did, of like, I think a lot of times as nature-based therapists, we want to believe that like nature is so much better than being indoors, right? It's so much better for all kids. And we have to kind of use our clinical reasoning in order to be aware that nature is not always the best setting for certain kids. So can you talk a little bit about like I think you guys mentioned it in the summary, or like the takeaways kind of conclusions would be the formal word for it, I think. But
and that was one of our, again, calls to action around what is still missing from this literature base, and what I think would come out of having a clear definition of what this practice is, would be requiring more of an explanation of who this intervention is appropriate for. That obviously, as human beings, we all have varying levels of interaction with different types of nature. But something I hadn't even thought about, I can't remember where I read this now, was thinking about kids who have experienced natural disasters. Like, we might have an issue around mental health relationship to nature that is not an appropriate place to start our intervention outdoors with those kids. Or, a nature space where there are animals that are scaring the kid, so that we're like never getting past that. How is that going to be therapeutic for them? So not to say like those specific examples would get defined, but part of outlining what nature-based therapy practice is saying what it's not and who it's not for. And that, doesn't mean that it might not eventually be appropriate for whoever it is, but it's not always the right first choice, and it might not ever be the right choice, depending on who the client is. So I do think that's something we kind of said would hopefully come out of people being more explicit in literature when they're writing about this type of work. That's our hope for future authors in this arena, is to write that out. And I think, I see practices that will put, like, if a client is considering coming to work with them, like, here are some things you might want to consider before choosing us for your work. And I think that's really important, because it's not going to be for everybody. Certainly, we can't say, like, don't come here if you don't like nature, because that's absolutely the opposite. We're helping people to like it. But it's just as important to say who this is not appropriate for as it is to say who it is for.
Right. So. And then kind of the other side of the coin maybe is the issue of access, right?
Absolutely.
Like there's kids who we may want it to be to use nature for, or I know we don't try to say use nature, but or like partner with nature to provide an excellent service.
Love
but
it.
But there's some kids that we might want to see out in nature, but they can't access the environment for whatever reason. And I feel like you guys mentioned that too as well. Yes.
Yeah, I think what was specifically interesting to me, the recent article from Furby and Rain that came out was talking about OT's role in addressing access to nature. They weren't focused on pediatrics, but I think if you're a peds therapist that typically works in the neurodevelopmental differences and disabilities arena, that physical disabilities specifically around access can get to be something that you're less familiar and comfortable with. And specifically in the context of the United States, we were just walking in our neighborhood to a different part of the neighborhood, and there are no more curb cuts, and the curbs are like a foot high. And I was like, it was not accessible to my dog who has a spinal condition. So like those, if that little thing isn't accessible, imagine trying to get to a park in your community. Like all of those things amount to occupational injustice in terms of access to nature spaces.
Yeah.
And it can go all the way back to, is there a walking distance nature space to you? Like, do you have access, whether or not it is a societal barrier? All of those access issues. I don't know how many nature-based occupational therapists are necessarily explicitly thinking about that if this is a new practice area for them. I loved that you had the adaptation in regards to the national parks conversation on this podcast. Like, it's such an important space for us to think about advocacy in, but it is something to be explicit about. Like, I was just seeing a creator on Instagram say, you don't just say like inclusive, accessible, like to who? You don't need to say that. What you need to say is, we have like curb cuts here. We have accessible trails for wheel-based mobility. Like, just give the features of the space so that people can decide for themselves if it's accessible to them.
Right.
But anyway, that's another tangent.
Well, yeah. And I think, I mean, it's great we bring this up because this is a whole other way, I think, specifically for OTs and maybe PTs as well, to be doing nature-based work where we're advocating for the physical environmental context to be welcoming and accessible to our clients or to the people that we're serving. And so I know Ashlyn, who I interviewed, who you referenced, she did work in the national parks, Ashlyn Southard. And then Freya McGregor is not doing pediatrics, but she was interviewed on this podcast a while back. And she does work, her business is called Access Birding, and she's doing work like nationally, like doing these visits. She's writing a book. She's doing visits to these sites all over the US in order to write a book for accessibility for people who want to engage in the occupation of birding. And so it's really cool to see, like, I think how we've kind of talked about, like, we're kind of in any kind of work you do, you kind of think of the definition of what you do as the definition, right? Like, nature-based therapy is taking kids out into nature to do therapy. But there's lots of ways of doing nature-based work as an occupational therapist. And this accessibility thing and advocacy, that's a whole nother can of worms, to use a sort of nature metaphor. But there's a lot of different ways to do this work. So I just think it's cool that you guys brought that out. I feel like we've kind of covered like role of occupational therapy, which was the next section in the article. We kind of accidentally just dove into that discussion.
Happens naturally.
Yeah, right. Are there other takeaways just from the discussion that you feel like really highlighting before we kind of wrap up here?
I think the piece that is funny to me and feels important to mention here, specifically on this podcast, is about other allied health professionals. So that obviously wasn't findings from this review, because we were specifically looking for interventions that were led by an occupational therapist.
Yep.
But this article was published in Physical and Occupational Therapy in Pediatrics, which their readership is not just OT. And so that was one of the interesting and sometimes frustrating, but mostly joyful aspects of the publishing process for this article, was that we hadn't included discussion around other professionals until that was specifically called out to us. And I think the important thing to me that I should have thought about right from the start in writing this is about interdisciplinary work in nature-based practice, because I love working on a team. I've worked with mental health therapists outdoors. I've worked with PTs outdoors. Would love to work with SLPs outdoors. And the best way to make that merger happen in terms of its validity is to be clear about what my scope of practice is versus yours, and how we both bring to the table our different skill sets and ways of thinking about this work to support the client. And it was fun to do like a mini look into what literature is out there for PT and SLP specifically, is what we chose to do. Spoiler alert, there's not a lot for you guys either.
Right.
But I think it's important for all of us to be on this journey. It's not just like, I want OT to do this. I really would love for all these allied health professionals to advance their work in these areas, if only to support our work together. You know, like it supports us each individually and helps us come together to form teams that can really help our clients in a more meaningful way that isn't talking over each other.
Yeah. And to understand our scope and how we like complement each other and how we can help support each other's work. We talked a little bit about this on the last podcast. I think it's going to be the one right before I publish this one. So Carolyn Parker, the speech therapist who came on the podcast, just about like being able to, because I was kind of saying like the logistics of it are hard sometimes because of how do you pay all the therapists to do a co-treat, right? Like it's from a business standpoint, it becomes hard to figure out like the financial piece of making it sustainable in a business model for everyone to be co-treating. But one of the things that she had said was like, sometimes she'll just do, well, we agreed. Neither of us had actually co-treated in nature, but we were talking about the benefits of it, right? And how cool it would be. And one of the things she said she thought would work is like doing a session, right? But then what she learns from the PT or the OT in that session, she can take back to her individual speech sessions with the child and implement and kind of be like working on each other's goals as we go. So I do think it could be a really, really powerful way of kind of just even increasing the benefit of nature and a therapist and another therapist. Like, ultra therapeutic.
And that's, I mean, I have never co-treated an individual client. I think the way I've seen it happen is with a PT seeing their client whose goals are amenable to working with my client. And so us working together with an individual client. And it's the same thing of like, we're not co-treating, but we're seeing what the other person is doing. We're able to talk about both kids after the session and support each other in our work because of that cross-pollination of ideas. So
that's really cool. That's like, I guess I wasn't thinking about it as like two kids, but that's a co-treat too, like two kids and two therapists. That's a great way to think about it. Camps too are another way, like getting a larger group of kids and having like two therapists as well. One thing I wanted to ask you about as we're kind of winding down or wrapping up, either way we want to say it. You guys wrote that we talked a little bit about like it can be a negative experience, right, for kids to be in nature. And so we want to be aware of that as therapists. And then you said, due to these and other potential risks, this is page 9 of the article. Due to these and other potential risks inherent to conducting therapy in the outdoors, expected competencies for this practice area should be explicitly delineated. I just thought that was a very insightful comment about the unique considerations that we need to make in our skill sets as therapists and in our knowledge and the competencies that we have in order to do work outdoors. So I don't know, do you have comments on that or thoughts or I thought it was a very important point to make.
Yeah, I think it's always an interesting conversation around when something becomes like, you must show that you can do this before we'll let you do it. Like when is something a required like licensing requirement, and when is something just like, oh, you'd be better if you did this, or like you take it or leave it. And I am loath to add like continuing education, like pay for more things, do more things that are like required and everybody and all of that. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that this is a specialized practice area. This, in the same way that if you're working in a therapy gym that has up high equipment and suspended equipment, like there are risks inherent to that as well.
Right.
And being appropriately trained to do the work that you're doing is really important, both for your own safety, your legal safety, all of it is there. And it was kind of interesting to me reading literature on some of the animal assisted therapies that do have clear guidelines. Like if you're going to be bringing a dog into your therapy session, these are the things that you need to have shown competence in and be trained around. And this is an emerging practice area, so that hasn't been well outlined yet for us. But it, like in any space where there are nature-based therapists discussing their work, there's conversations around like risk liability, what kinds of like risks are appropriate. And I think all of that should be front of mind in terms of everyone's safety and in terms of the skill with which you're conducting a therapy session. So I feel good that would be an outcome of defining our scope, would be clearer about what those competencies are. But it was a conversation because anyone can do this. And this is a special practice area.
Anyone can do it, but it does take skill and expertise to do it well. Right. And I think that that's what's important. And I do think that therapists in general are people who want to learn and grow. And like the people who are entering this are like, they want to learn and grow, and they want to be expert at being a nature-based OT. If that's if that's the work they've chosen to do, then that's going to be motivating for them to kind of learn and become better at that. And, we do. I love the John Dewey quote, like, we don't learn by doing, we learn by reflecting on our doing. And I think a lot of times we don't pause to actually do that reflection. We just are doing, and we're not pausing. Right. And so those reflective practice kind of questions that we can ask ourselves after sessions, I think are really, really important to help us kind of integrate that learning from the doing, in which we often learn from failure. And that is okay.
Look, this is beautiful. Once I'm at the stage of being done with my dissertation research, I'm going to come back to that quote, because that is the bridge between my passion for nature-based work and what I actually ended up studying as part of my PhD, which was reflective practice. So there you go.
Right. Okay.
All in the journey.
Yeah, because this is good for people to hear too, like understanding part of the process. So like, this wasn't your dissertation. This was a publication you did before your dissertation. You are still doing your dissertation research, and it's on reflective practice, but not on nature-based occupational therapy, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And, doesn't make a ton of sense, but a PhD is a PhD. It's not a career. And so we're starting where we are, and we're going to go where we need to go. And reflective practice is so near and dear to my heart that I'm happy to be in that space. But the place I want to take it is to how powerful it is to apply in an emerging practice setting like this nature-based work. So
I love it.
We'll get there. But this was a passion project, this paper, just on the side of the dissertation.
Just on the side. Just a passion project while I'm doing my PhD.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
I'm so grateful to you for coming on and discussing this with us, because I feel like we really got to have a good conversation about OT, but also like the broader kind of allied health too. We kind of pulled in like we want to do on this podcast. And I appreciate you kind of making those connections in the article as well. So can you tell people where they can connect with you online? Like, I know where to find you, but tell everyone where they can find you and connect with you.
Yeah, absolutely. The space that I am most commonly and where it's easiest to connect with me is Instagram. So you can find me at the nature-based OT. If you're interested in reading this article but don't have access, you can reach out to me. I have some links that I could share it for people to read. But certainly I have Facebook. I have Twitter, but
you don't look at those very much. So
I really, like, if you want to hear back from me, Instagram is the best way to go.
Right. I find Facebook, I've said it before, I find Facebook it's like, I have multiple profiles and like messages get hidden. And like, I don't understand why they make it so hard. Instagram's so much easier to me to use. But anyways, for what it's worth, Hannah's on Instagram.
Yes.
The Nature-Based OT, which is the best handle ever, I have to say. I love it. And I love your logo. Okay, before I have to ask this because I've always loved your little logo that you have, like the little picture you have. Tell us about that just as a little aside before we sign off here.
I'm so happy that you asked because I love that logo. It was designed for me by my friend who is an artist. Her name is Ellie Daniels. She does incredible work. And it's meant to be thinking about bridging practice and research, which is why there's a bridge. And it is personal to me because it's meant to kind of be an ode to the bridge over Multnomah Falls, which is outside of Portland, Oregon, which is my hometown and where I'm from. So it's just my little like nature space in a little logo. So
I love it. I've always just thought it was such a beautiful, it's such a beautiful logo. And I've always wondered. So I'm so glad I asked you and that it has such meaning to you. That's so great.
It does. Thank you.
Love it. Thanks for being here, Hannah. I'm going to talk to you soon.
Thanks, Laura.
Okay, so Hannah and I were chatting after we stopped recording, and we have one more thing that we want to say. So Hannah, you were just saying how research is not everything. It's not like the be all end all, the only thing that we can like use to guide our practice. So say a little more what you were just saying.
I was saying something about the fact that evidence is there as a tool and something that we can use. And it's not, what was the word I used, Laura?
Well, I think you said it's not God.
I did say that. Which I feel strongly about. I don't know. It gets put up on a pedestal and that's not what evidence is there for. It's there to serve you in your work as a practitioner and it's a tool for you. It is not the thing that we have to live our lives by.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's definitely like evidence-based practice doesn't mean we're just doing only what research says. Like we're using our brains, we're using reflective practice, we're using the people that we know that are doing this work, mentors and experts to kind of inform what we're doing in our work. And especially in a emerging practice area like this. I just realized I'm not really talking directly into my mic, so it probably sounds different. So sorry if the sound quality is bad on this part, y'all. But really, I think it's important to remember that. And I just wanted to like quick record that little sound bite. So
yes, evidence-based practice is so much more than research. So
yes.
There we are.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks so much for joining us today for Therapy in the Great Outdoors. If you can't get enough, if you just want even more information about nature-based pediatric practice, head on over to therapyinthegreatoutdoors.com. At that website, you can join our free community, Therapy in the Great Outdoors, that has loads of resources for you to support your nature-based work with children, as well as a free ebook that I wrote called The Nature-Based Practice Roadmap. It is a guide to help you focus and avoid costly mistakes, which I might have made myself, as you start or grow your nature-based pediatric practice. On the website, you can also join the waitlist for the Contigo Approach online course. Contigo stands for Connection and Transformation in the Great Outdoors. This course will teach you everything you need to know to become an expert in nature-based pediatric therapy. To my knowledge, it is the only evidence-based, operationalized framework for pediatric nature-based therapy. And what that means is that when you take the Contigo Approach course, you will have a shared mental model for yourself, your clients, and your team. And this is how you grow a business, by having a framework that you use in your business that helps kind of anchor everyone to what is going on here and what are we doing. You'll learn about the research-based and theoretical foundations of nature-based practice and loads of practical how-tos about nature-based practice. How can you do nature-based practice in alignment with the evidence in order to get the best results for your clients? So a lot of times when people start out in nature-based work, I think they're DIYing it, which is fine. We learn a lot by DIYing things. However, you're not often sure if you're doing things correctly. And that means you could be making mistakes that could be costing you valuable time with families and children and getting them the outcomes that they really want from your session. DIYing also costs you personally valuable time and money as you are getting started in nature-based work. And this course can save you all of that time and money. This course also includes lifetime access, including any updates we make, and ongoing mentoring for years to come on our mentoring calls that we offer with the online course. So truly gives you everything you need to become an expert. I promise that. And it's the only course that will guarantee that for you. So head on over to therapyinthegreatoutdoors.com. You can also go to contigoapproach.com, but I have tried to make everything available at therapyinthegreatoutdoors.com to make it easy to find all of the resources there in one place for you. That's it for today. Get outdoors, connect, reflect, and enjoy the business and practice of therapy in the great outdoors.